to do so. You know, over the years, there's been those times when I've walked with a limp. You know, I remember early on as a young teenager, racing my bicycle, and my chain skipped. I was on a borrowed bicycle, and the chain skipped, and my foot went down hard, hit the asphalt, and the pedal behind, you know, my foot came off the pedal, and the pedal hit my foot, and it went right down here. They put a cast on my leg up to here for about 6 weeks, and, you know, I couldn't bend this leg. It was miserable. It was hot. It was summertime. It would itch right down below the kneecap. I discovered taking a coat hanger, clothes hanger, a wire clothes hanger. You could stick that thing down in there and scratch right where it itched. And I remember riding my bicycle after the fact, even with the cast on. I'd pull the pedal up, push the pedal down, pull the pedal up, push the pedal down with one leg, the other leg sticking out. And then sometimes you fall the wrong way. You'd have to brace here because I was not allowed to put pressure on the bottom of that leg. Needless to say, by the time I get to the doctor's office 6 weeks later and they go about cutting this thing off, the doctor is upset and he says, "I ought to make you wear this thing another 2 weeks," because the bottom was all caved in from being in the grass and dirt and whatever and mush. And I'm sitting in the waiting room and while Dad's paying the bill, and I'm playing with my leg outside of a cast, and I'm doing this, and all of a sudden I pull it back a little bit and that thing comes back tight in a cramp. And I let out a scream because I can't get my leg out, and the people come running and they help me get my leg stretched out. And that was back in the day when they didn't do physical therapy, especially for teenage kids. They figured you'd figure it out. Well, that hurt so bad when my leg cramped that I babied it. And I would limp because I couldn't bend that leg, because I didn't want to bend the leg. It hurt so bad. So I would limp, and I discovered that when it was time to run, I would kind of hop limp, you know. It's like you hop on your good leg twice and then once on your bad leg. And eventually, I knew that if I kept doing that, I would indeed limp the rest of my life. And I forced myself to exercise the leg. But it took a lot longer than if I'd had physical therapy. I remember one time, you know, it's like, it's one of those duh moments. I'm using a cutting torch. I'm a mechanic, and I have a piece of iron laying on a bed or on a bench, and I've got the cutting torch and got my goggles on, and I'm cutting this. It was a tongue of a tractor, so it was yay thick and about this wide and yay long, and I'm cutting it off. The thing falls on my foot. I limped a while, just really limped. And then there was this one time when we were with some friends, and we were up in Iowa City by Hippie Bridge, and there's this little walkway, and it's got pipe rail going here and pipe rail going here. It's just part of the walkway. It's not on the bridge itself. But we're doing the little walk on the pipe kind of thing up there. And it's kind of fun. And if you kind of lose your balance, you always fell inward, and you could kind of step over to the other rail and kind of catch yourself. Well, one time I stepped over there, foot went off that rail, down I came on my hip. And I was black and blue from belt to knee for quite a while, and still have a little knot here. We limp because of an injury that comes to us. And sometimes it hurts so much when it hits us that we adjust our body to take care of that. I remember soon after I came, we did a survey of the surrounding 64 square miles to find out who was churched and who wasn't churched. And a dear old sister in our midst, Luella Yoder, was out there. I don't know how old she was, 60s, 70s, I don't know for sure. And she went to somebody's house, came out, and slipped on the sidewalk and fell and hurt her leg. And she limped the rest of her life. I always felt kind of bad about that, but she limped the rest of her life. We don't do well with pain, generally. In fact, we don't like pain. How many of you like pain? I knew that. You don't. And yet, did you ever notice how when you do sports, extreme sports, we say we don't like pain, but when I went with the guys skiing in Colorado, and you're up there above tree line, and you decide to do the bowl, you know it's going to hurt. Somehow it's going to hurt. But the thrill of doing it anyway, you say, well, it's not going to hurt that bad. And so down you go. And sometimes it doesn't hurt very bad, but sometimes it does. So today's message comes out of earlier this week. At the beginning of the week, I was doing some journaling and just kind of reflecting back over the year thus far and or the past 12 months and just trying to pay attention of what's happened and identifying. It's really about identifying what's happening in me. And so I'm just writing. I journal on my computer and thinking back through Micah's death and Eileen's brother John's death and then now Eileen's mom's death and just so what's going on inside of me and realizing that I'm still positive. I score very high on the whatever that strength scale is. I forget what it's called now. Strength Finder's strength scale scored top of the list of positivity. It's my disposition. It's a God-given gift to me to be positive. And the glass is always at least half full. If it's only half full, it's probably 2/3 full because it's just how I see it. So it's a gift. But in that moment of writing in my journal, I realized that, yes, I'm still positive. I still have some joy. But I wrote down, I said, but my soul definitely has a limp. There's a limp in my soul. It seems that even my joy is kind of laced with tears, and there's always this lump in my throat, just right there. And then, of course, I asked the question, what really is joy? What is it? Is it a feeling? Is it a sense? Is it an aura? What is it? And then I wrote, how can I truly embrace the pain, truly embrace the pain, embrace the limp, and still dance with joy? And then later on that morning, Jamie Kerr and I were talking, and we were just talking, and he said something to the effect, your preaching is different. Not worse, not better, it's just different. So yeah, is that good or bad? Dunno. Just different. Never in all of history, I think, have we created a life of pleasure as we know it today. pleasure and happiness. It's what we're about. We try to create our world for pleasure and happiness. Remove all manner of pain. Who likes it? We don't usually. We do things to avoid it. You know, you talk about pain, you get a paper cut on your finger, and it's like, oh, man. But that pain's a whole lot different than getting an arm or a leg tore off, isn't it? Pain in its context makes a difference. Women having babies, tremendous pain. Almost no matter how you look at it. Put me to sleep, take that baby out of there, you still have to wake up. And yet they do it again and again. Pain in the context makes a difference. Pain and suffering is normal. And I have this feeling that we need to learn to embrace our pain. When we can embrace the pain, we can embrace the limp, we can embrace the healing and joy. Jesus, in Isaiah 53, says he was despised and rejected. Jesus didn't say it. Well, it says about Jesus in Isaiah 53, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Familiar with it. I don't want to be familiar with suffering. It haggles my positivity. Jesus was familiar with suffering. So sometimes we need this special touch from God to just kind of wake us up from our meandering, and sometimes it leaves a bit of painful results. The natural is often a shadow of the spiritual. And so when I wrote that in my journal, I just had to think back to Jacob. And Jacob gained a limp. And so I'm going to go to Genesis 32. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Jacob. And I trust that because you're different than me, the majority of you, your natural gifting that God has given you is not that of Mr. Positivity. It's something else. And so you have to find your limp as well. So here's Jacob. He's got a biography that's just messed up. Jacob, the word means deceiver. And he was a deceiver. He conned his brother, who was the firstborn. Esau was the firstborn. Jacob was hanging on to his heel because Jacob wanted to be the firstborn. And when he caught Esau when he was very hungry, and he said, "I'll trade you my food for your birthright." Fine. Esau was a kind of a rammy kind of guy and lived for the moment and thought, doesn't do me any good to have a birthright if I'm dead. So he said, sure. He sold him his birthright for some food. And then later on, to have the birthright meant you really should get the blessing. But Dad's still going to give the guy who was born first, the blessing. And so Jacob and his mother was part of the act here, and they dressed Jacob to feel and to smell like his brother Esau, cooked up some food to make his dad, who was basically blind, to make him think that he was eating wild game that Esau would have got. Jacob goes in, steals the blessing that Isaac, his father, prays out upon him. So Jacob's life is this life of deception, conniving one time after the other. And so that's what's happening, and that takes us to the account of verse 7. Well, let me say, so Jacob has really ticked off his brother Esau. His brother Esau makes some comment when dad was getting old and about to die or getting closer there. He's like, you know what? When dad dies, I'm going to get him. I'm going to kill him. And the word got around, came back to Jacob and his mother that Esau is upset and he's going to kill him. And so Jacob decides to pack bags and move away, and his dad says, you know, go to your uncle Laban and go there and find a wife. And so he does. And he gets to Laban, he finds Rachel, his dream lady, and wants her hand in marriage, and dad says, or her dad says, well, you have to work for me for 7 years to get her. He says, fine. So he works for 7 years. He wakes up the next morning after the wedding and discovers, oops, it's not Rachel. It's her sister Leah, her older sister Leah. And that was Laban, according to Laban was really a deceiver also. He was a conniver also. And he said, yeah, that's our tradition. We give the oldest one in marriage first. So if you want the next one, well, you know, in a week from now you can have her, but you'll have to work another 7 years. And so Jacob was madly in love, and he did it. It was like, what's another 7 years? He's at least got his wife while he's doing it. And then time goes on, and Laban is forever conniving and making raw deals, and somehow God is with Jacob, and Jacob's a half a step ahead of Laban, and he starts getting really blessed. And finally, he's had it with Laban, and he's feeling the tug to go back home. And so he knows good and well, because Laban is Laban. If he tells Laban, he's going to connive and somehow not let him go. So he takes off and runs, and Laban pursues, and there's an exchange. And anyway, finally they bless him, and Jacob is off to go. But the problem is, Jacob has to deal with his life. He has to meet up with Esau, because he's not only going back home to his father, he's going back home to Esau. And he is scared out of his mind, because what makes him think that Esau has forgotten? The guy who hated him, who he gave just cause to hate, who said, I'm going to kill you. So Jacob heads for home, and he's getting closer to Esau, and so he sends a bunch of guys out ahead and go to meet with Esau and says, hey, I, your brother Jacob, and with this message, I, your brother Jacob, am coming, and in fact, I, your brother, your servant, am coming with all my stuff, and I pray I can find favor with you. And the guys come back and say, oh yeah, Esau is here to meet you. He's coming to meet you. Him along with 400 men. And Jacob is really, really shaking. And so he sends all sorts of gifts, and he divides his big party, all of his family and everything, and he sends some of them out ahead, and he and his prized possession of his wife and kids are in the next party. So he sends out the first party with all these gifts, and they cross the river, and Jacob goes off to camp by himself, because he needs a little alone time. And this is where the story comes in, chapter 32. Let's see if I can find it. Chapter 32, verse 22. That night Jacob got up, took his wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." And Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed by Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. He was limping because of his hip. So as I think about that, and I think about limping because of his hip, we sang the song this morning, "All of my life, in every season, I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship." But it's only if you can look at the whole picture. At any given moment of your life, you can have so much pain that you can wonder, why would I sing? And why would I worship? And yet, all of my life, I have a reason to sing. In every season, I have a reason to worship. As I just kind of read through this account, I saw about 3 things that I just want to share with you, and there's lots more, but, I want you to get going on it and deal with it in your own life. But the 3 that I'm going to talk about for a moment is, first of all, there's a night of reckoning. For Jacob, there came this night when he thought he was alone with God, or alone by himself to just kind of deal with it. He realized that he wasn't alone. And it was like there was a man, whether it was an angel, whether it was God, it was a little hard to say at the time. And I remember often thinking, well, it wasn't God because really, who's going to win in that battle? But I think it was God, because he said, "I've seen the face of God, and I'm still alive." But he needed this alone time. He had his conscience to deal with. I think the Lord needed to meet up with this deceiver guy because he needed to make him face up to his past if he was going to usher him into his destiny. God needs us to face up to our past. Some of us have a past that's not all that good. Some of us have a past that we'd just as soon not talk about. There's some things of my past I'd just as soon not let anybody know. But until we face our past, embrace our stupidity, our mistakes, until we're ready to say, you know what, that was me. I did that. What an idiot. That was me. When we're ready to embrace that, then God can usher us into our destiny and saying, that was you, but we've been taken through resurrection, into resurrection. That was you, now I'm taking you into your destiny. So there was the night of reckoning. You know, it's not very often that God physically tangles with man. There's not so much in here, but he physically tangled with Jacob. Says he struggled, and God couldn't overpower him. Couldn't overpower Jacob? Are you kidding me? God could have overpowered Jacob. But Jacob was grappling with himself that night. And the Lord didn't pin him, I'm convinced, because he needed to struggle through himself. He needed to put to rest his past in order to take him to the future. The Father is such a father. God is such a father. He doesn't force, he doesn't overpower us. He allows us to struggle, to deal with ourselves, because love doesn't force. Love doesn't pressure. Love invites. And Jacob struggled, and struggled. And I think the battle was with himself as much as with God. God was turning him into a son instead of a slave. Slaves are overpowered. Sons struggle, deal with themselves. And the Father gives him a new identity freely. And yet he comes out with a limp. And in that struggle, he gains a new identity. Instead of Jacob, which means deceiver, he became Israel, meaning he struggles with God. In fact, through the rest of history, the people are called Israelites. People who struggle with God. Why? Because we struggle with ourselves. And we need to struggle with ourselves. And we struggle with God in that process. And I think we limp. And I think we're called to limp. We have an identity that while we soar, yet still we limp. It's kind of like Paul, the apostle, was given a thorn in the flesh to keep him from being too proud, too cocky, too much like I've got it all. He had a limp. Paul had a limp. So, there's a night of reckoning. Number 2, there's a certain amount of avoiding of rough terrain. I remember when I was still limping from this leg, and my buddies and I, we were in town. It was after curfew, and we were places we shouldn't have been, and we were, all of a sudden, somebody's lights came on, and we knew that we needed to run. And where I was at was not a good place to run. There was trash laying around, and I remember hop-skipping through that maze of trash, running as I could run. And we didn't get caught, but I remember thinking, what an idiot, and I didn't have my plan of escape should the lights come on. So, when we struggle with ourselves and we struggle with God and we have a limp, we avoid certain terrain. We start knowing where this is going to take me. And so we we're a little more careful. And careful is good. Not so careful that you don't ever get hurt, but careful, at least not being foolish. So it becomes a bit of a navigator. Hebrews 12:12 says, "Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed." Could have really messed up my leg all over again that night. Make level paths for your feet. I think the lesson with that, with good old Jacob, is why did he have to limp? Well, when you limp, you can't run as well. Jacob had a history of running away. I sometimes run away. And I don't try to run away, I just try to avoid the pain. Mr. Positivity has a hard time embracing pain. So you just run away. Now, as I relate with Eileen, sometimes I think she runs towards the pain. She camps in the pain. So like I say, everybody limps a little differently. Can you embrace the pain, embrace the limp, and still dance for joy? And I don't know that I run away, I just don't face it very well. But I'm learning. There was that moment in our history when our son Micah was about 16, 17 years old, 18, somewhere in there, and he had run away from home, and he was living in Iowa City, and his life was a mess, and he was a mess, and we were a mess. And I remember going to meet with him at some point to pick him up or whatever to go for breakfast, and he had them nasty contacts that looked like cat eyes. And I know he was trying to shock me with them, and I was shocked, but I tried not to let him know I was shocked. It's just like, okay. But out of that year or two of his wandering, really wandering, drifting, very confused, messed up, something happened in Eileen and me. That ever since, in fact, it happened just not too long ago. A couple weeks ago, we were somewhere, and we saw this person walk by, and I mean, she looked a mess. You know, the typical mess to me is just being tattooed silly and piercings all over and clothes from another generation or two ago. And I mean, and we looked at each other and said, she's somebody's daughter. She's somebody's daughter. That's what a limp will do to you. All of a sudden, you can see beyond what stares you in the face, and you see beyond it. And you understand, which then takes me into the third point. And the third point is that it leaves you a marked man. It leaves you with a mark. You can't hide a limp. Just can't hide it. It's always begging to show itself. Others were bound to notice how Jacob now walked. It's kind of like driving into Iowa City and you see the panhandlers, and one of those guys up there is on 2 prosthetics from his knees down, or his bottom. Can't hide it. You know what? He's been through the battle. Sign says, "A veteran, can you help?" Limps. So when you see somebody limping, what do? You say, so what happened to you? And then you get to tell your story. And I'm convinced that, well, just in the last 2 days, I listened to a couple TED Talks. I love TED Talks. And I listened to a couple of them on pain and suffering. And what was I going to say this? What was I going to say? Oh, I found it interesting that without any religious background that I am aware of, the people doing the TED Talk, one of the points they made is that your community helps in bringing healing. Your family helps in bringing healing. And I am convinced that Israel limped, obviously. In fact, so that the people of Israel would never again eat the tendon of that part of the leg because it had become kind of a holy mark. So as we limp, we get to tell the story. We get to tell the story, I was Jacob, the deceiver. And now I am limping because I struggled. I fought the battle with myself and with God. And I am gaining healing. And there's a miraculous work. I'm gaining a new part of my identity even. I am of the resurrected sort. I can limp and I can dance with joy. So you get to share your history, which we all know is his story. So my frequent prayer these days is that indeed my heart will soon be free of pain. But the reality is, we are to be familiar with pain. Whoever decided that the definition of happiness, joy, peace was freedom from pain? We in America, we in the Western world, we think no pain should be our gain. So as soon as we find pain, we take ibuprofen, Prozac, alcohol, trying to rid ourselves of pain. When I think Father wants us to embrace our pain, because he's wanting to do a work in our struggle that we gain an identity with him. So while I pray that I could be free of pain, I pray greater that God will continue to apprehend me, continue to put his mark on me, that my soul might always limp a bit. Just limp a bit. That my joy might always be laced with tears. And that never too far from me might be the lump in my throat. There's all sorts of pains that can create that limp in you. A week or two ago, Eileen mentioned the shadow of death. That it's a whole lot bigger than just death as in dying and our life is over death. We have all kinds of deaths. We have all kinds of pains. We have all kinds of disillusionments. We had hope for this. We have broken hearts. It didn't pan out like we thought it was going to. Can you embrace it? Or will you struggle with God that He will let you taste more in His goodness? Can you embrace the limp? Let's pray. So, Father, this morning, we want to be the kind of people who can indeed embrace the pain, who can indeed embrace the limp, and yes, who can indeed dance for joy. Father, I don't know what everybody's pain is in their life here. In this moment, I just ask, Father, that you would meet each one of us, because you know our pain. You know what our struggle is. Would you struggle with us, even against us if you need to, for us to embrace that pain, for us to struggle with ourselves until we gain the new identity with you, Father, as sons, as daughters, as kids of the kingdom, as victors. Thank you. Thank you. Amen.